The pilot stepped into the aisle, pointed straight at the old man, and said, "You get off this plane, now." The cabin went silent as security was called, and the old man slowly stood up without a word. But right before he reached the door, everything stopped, because that unwanted passenger was the reason this flight even existed. Before you watch, hit like, share this story, and comment below. Would you have stepped in or stayed quiet? A light rain brushed against the glass of Atlanta Airport, soft and steady, as if the sky itself was waiting for something to unfold. Inside, the terminal pulsed with quiet urgency, footsteps, rolling luggage, distant announcements. But Elias Carter sat still among it all. He was 78, thin, with tired eyes and a worn brown coat that had seen better years. He moved slowly, not weak, just careful, like someone who had learned long ago that rushing never saved anyone. War had shaped him once, left him quiet, observant, and used to being overlooked. Today, he held a paper ticket. It was slightly creased. His name was printed on it, but not quite correctly. One letter wrong. Enough for a system to hesitate. Not enough for anyone to care. Around him, people passed without seeing him. A businessman frowned at his phone. A child dragged a stuffed toy across the floor. Life moved forward, indifferent. Elias simply watched, his gaze calm, distant, like he had seen too much to be surprised by small things anymore. When boarding was called, he stood slowly and joined the line. No rush, no complaint, just quiet acceptance. At the gate, a young agent scanned his ticket. She paused for a brief second, barely noticeable, then let him through. Procedure mattered more than curiosity. Elias nodded once and continued walking. Down the jet bridge, the hum of the aircraft grew louder. Something about it felt familiar. Not comfort, not fear, just awareness. The kind that never really leaves a man who has survived things others never will. Inside the cockpit, Captain Ryan Cole studied the passenger list. He was in his early 50s, sharp-eyed, disciplined, a man who trusted systems more than people. Years of command had made him confident in one thing, his judgment, and right now, something didn't add up. A flagged name, an inconsistency, a passenger who didn't fit. He leaned closer to the screen. The system refreshed. Still there. Still wrong. Ryan frowned. He didn't like mistakes. Mistakes meant risk, and risk meant loss of control. He stood, adjusting his uniform cap, his movements precise. To him, this wasn't personal. It was order. It was responsibility. But beneath that, something else lingered. Assumption. The cabin began to fill. Passengers settled into their seats, conversations blending into a low hum. Elias found his place and sat down quietly, placing his ticket carefully into his coat pocket. He didn't look around. He didn't need to. He had learned long ago that attention rarely brought anything good. Back in the cockpit, Ryan exhaled slowly, then made a decision. He stepped out. The cockpit door opened with a soft click. Cool air drifted in. His eyes scanned the rows with practiced authority, quick, precise, searching, until they stopped. On one man, old, alone, worn coat, sitting where, in Ryan's mind, he did not belong. And in that single glance, without a word spoken, without a question asked, Ryan decided. Not with facts, not with truth, but with something far more dangerous. Judgment. And somewhere deep in the quiet hum of that aircraft, something invisible began to crack. Ryan Cole walked down the aisle with the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed, not questioned, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the carpet. He stopped beside Elias Carter and looked at him the way one might look at a misplaced object, something that simply did not belong where it was found. "Your ticket has an issue," he said, his voice flat, controlled, almost bored. "I need you to step off the aircraft." Elias slowly lifted his gaze, his eyes calm, steady, carrying the weight of years rather than fear. He did not argue. He did not plead. He simply reached into his coat and handed over the wrinkled ticket, the paper soft from being folded and unfolded too many times, the single wrong letter in his name sitting there like a quiet mistake no one wanted to correct. Ryan barely glanced at it before handing it back, already certain of his conclusion. Around them, the cabin shifted. A few passengers leaned slightly into the aisle. curiosity pulling them closer while politeness held them back. One man in his 40s, wearing a gray suit and loosened tie, Daniel Mercer, a corporate lawyer used to observing more than speaking, tilted his phone subtly, not yet recording, but ready. He had built a career on noticing moments others ignored, and something about this felt wrong, though he could not yet explain why. Near the galley, Lena Brooks stood frozen. She was 26, new to the job, her uniform still too stiff on her shoulders, her smile something she had practiced more than lived. Growing up, she had learned to avoid conflict at all costs, raised by a single mother who believed survival meant staying quiet, blending in, never becoming the center of attention. And now, standing just a few feet away, she felt that old lesson pressing down on her chest, even as something inside her whispered that silence, this time, might be its own kind of mistake. "Sir," Ryan continued, his tone tightening slightly, "you are not listed correctly in the system. That makes you an unauthorized passenger. I suggest you cooperate before this escalates." The word unauthorized hung in the air, heavier than it should have been, turning a simple error into something far more serious. Elias looked at him for a long second, not with anger, but with a quiet recognition, as if he had heard words like this before, in different places, under different uniforms. "There is no mistake," Elias said softly, his voice low but clear. "I was given this ticket." There was no defensiveness in his tone, no attempt to convince, just a statement, simple and complete. Ryan's jaw tightened. He did not like answers that did not bend. Behind them, a middle-aged woman with short blonde hair, Marilyn Scott, a retired schoolteacher who had spent 30 years correcting small injustices in classrooms, shifted in her seat, her lips pressing into a thin line. She had seen this pattern before, authority stepping in too quickly, judgment forming too easily. But years of being told to mind her place had left her hesitating now, caught between instinct and habit. Ryan exhaled sharply, then gestured toward the aisle. "This is your final notice. Stand up and come with me." The words were no longer neutral. They carried weight now, threat, implication, the quiet promise of force if needed. The cabin grew quieter. Even the usual sounds, the rustling bags, the murmured conversations seemed to fade, as if the plane itself was listening. Elias placed the ticket back into his coat with deliberate care, his fingers steady despite the attention now focused on him. For a brief moment, his eyes moved across the cabin, not searching for help, not expecting it, just observing. Faces turned away. Eyes avoided his, the same pattern again. He had lived long enough to recognize it. Slowly, he placed his hands on the armrests and began to rise. Not because he agreed, not because he was wrong, but because sometimes he had learned standing up was not surrender. It was preparation. And as he lifted himself from the seat, the quiet in the cabin deepened, not empty, but heavy, like the air before something breaks. The aircraft remained at the gate, engines quiet, but the tension inside the cabin thickened like air before a storm that refused to break. Elias Carter stood fully now, steady on his feet, his posture straight despite his age, as if something older than his body was holding him upright. Captain Ryan Cole took a step back to give space, but not out of respect, out of control, as though the scene needed to remain within his command. "Escort will be here shortly," Ryan said, his voice clipped, already turning the moment into procedure, into something impersonal, something easier to justify. At the front of the cabin, Lena Brooks' fingers trembled over the small handheld device connected to the airline system. She wasn't supposed to dig deeper. New attendants were taught to follow, not question. But something about Elias, his stillness, his calm felt wrong in a way she couldn't ignore. She navigated through the passenger manifest again, her breath shallow, until she saw it. A hidden line. A code she had never seen before. Not airline issued, not civilian. Her training didn't cover this, but instinct whispered louder than rules. Department of Defense. The words didn't fully display, but they didn't need to. Her heart skipped. She looked up, eyes darting toward Ryan. "Captain, I think there might be." Her voice was small, uncertain, but it carried something real. Ryan didn't even turn fully toward her. A slight shake of his head. Dismissal. Final. "Not now," he said. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Authority rarely raises its voice when it believes it is right. Lena swallowed her words. They burned on the way down. In row 3, Daniel Mercer had now fully lifted his phone, recording. He was 42, composed, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. Years in courtrooms had taught him that truth often hid in ordinary moments until someone decided to look closer. He had seen arrogance before. He had seen power misused. But there was something about the quiet man standing in the aisle that unsettled him more than the confrontation itself. Elias wasn't reacting the way people usually did. No anger, no panic, just patience. And patience, Daniel knew, often meant something deeper was at play. 2 uniformed airport security officers stepped onto the plane. One of them, Officer James Holloway, mid-30s, broad-shouldered with a tired face, had spent years dealing with passengers who shouted, resisted, argued. He had learned to expect conflict. But when his eyes landed on Elias, he hesitated just for a second. This wasn't the man he expected. No raised voice, no clenched fists, just quiet. "Sir," Holloway said, softer than protocol required, "we need you to come with us." Elias looked at him, then nodded once. No resistance. That, somehow, made everything heavier. As Elias stepped into the aisle, a faint metallic clink echoed from inside his coat pocket. Small, almost unnoticeable, but Lena heard it. Her eyes widened slightly. Not fear recognition of something she couldn't yet name. Elias reached into his coat slowly, carefully, and pulled out a small object. Not a weapon, not anything threatening. Just a worn metal case, edges scratched, the surface dulled with time. He held it for a brief moment, as if grounding himself, then slipped it back inside. Ryan's eyes narrowed. Suspicion tightened his features, reinforcing everything he already believed. To him, this wasn't a man with history. It was a man with something to hide. "Let's move," Ryan said sharply. Elias took a step forward. The cabin parted slightly, passengers leaning away just enough to clear his path, not out of fear, but discomfort. The kind that comes when people sense they are witnessing something they don't fully understand. Marilyn Scott lowered her gaze, her hands tightening in her lap. She had spent years teaching children to stand up for what was right, and yet now, she sat still. The realization settled in her chest like weight. Daniel kept recording. Lena stood frozen, and Elias walked, not like a man being removed, but like a man who had walked into harder places and survived them all. As he reached the front of the cabin, he paused for just a fraction of a second. His eyes moved, not searching, not pleading, just observing. The same quiet awareness that had followed him through war, through loss, through years of being unseen. Then he stepped forward again, toward the open door. And somewhere deep within the system Lena had accessed, the hidden code remained unread, unspoken, waiting. History was still there, watching, and it had not yet decided to stay silent. The aircraft door remained open, and for a brief moment, nothing happened, just the low hum of electronics and the distant echo of airport announcements filtering through the jet bridge. Then footsteps approached, not rushed, not loud, but steady, measured, deliberate. A group of 3 individuals stepped onto the plane, all dressed in dark suits that seemed to absorb the light around them. They carried no visible urgency, yet their presence shifted the air instantly, like a change in pressure before a storm breaks. At the front was a man in his late 50s, tall, composed, with close-cropped gray hair and a face shaped by years of command rather than comfort. His name was Colonel David Harrington, a senior liaison officer for the Department of Defense. He had spent decades coordinating military operations where mistakes cost lives, not reputations. That past had carved something into him: precision, restraint, and a quiet intolerance for incompetence disguised as authority. His eyes moved once across the cabin, taking in everything, missing nothing. Behind him stood a younger woman, Agent Melissa Grant, early 30s, sharp-eyed, her posture rigid. She had come from a background in federal investigations where truth was rarely handed over willingly. It had taught her to read people quickly, to trust behavior more than words. She said nothing, but her gaze lingered on Ryan for just a fraction longer than necessary. "Where is he?" Harrington asked calmly. No one answered immediately. They didn't need to. Elias Carter stood just a few feet away, between the aisle and the open door, flanked loosely by Officer Holloway. Not restrained, not resisting, just waiting. Harrington walked forward, each step quiet but undeniable, until he stopped in front of Elias. For a moment, he simply looked at him, not scanning, not judging, but recognizing. Then, he opened the folder in his hand. Sergeant First Class Elias Carter, he said. The name landed differently this time. Not as a label. As a truth. A ripple passed through the cabin, subtle but real. Heads turned, shoulders shifted. Even Ryan, standing a few steps behind, felt it before he understood it. Harrington turned the folder slightly, just enough for those nearby to see. Inside were photographs old, slightly faded, but unmistakable. A younger man, covered in dust and sweat, carrying another soldier across a field torn apart by smoke and fire. The expression on that younger man's face wasn't fear. It was decision. It was Elias. In 1987, Harrington continued, his voice steady, this man carried multiple wounded soldiers out of an active combat zone under direct fire. He returned 4 times. He paused, letting the words settle. 23 lives were saved that night. Silence deepened. Not empty. Heavy. Ryan Cole felt something inside him tighten, then fracture. His certainty, the thing he had trusted most, began to slip, piece by piece. He looked at Elias again, but this time, the image didn't match what he had seen before. The coat was still worn. The man was still old. But now, those details felt irrelevant. Agent Grant stepped slightly forward, her voice calm but firm. This flight is operating under a Department of Defense directive, she said. Mr. Carter is the sole designated passenger under that directive. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Ryan. There is no error. No error. The words echoed louder than they should have. Behind them, Lena Brooks felt her breath catch. The code she had seen, the one she hadn't spoken, suddenly had meaning. And with that meaning came something else. Regret. Daniel Mercer lowered his phone slightly, his expression no longer neutral. What he had suspected was now undeniable. Not just a mistake. A failure. Officer Holloway straightened subtly, stepping back half a pace, instinctively giving Elias space not as a detainee, but as someone who no longer belonged in that position at all. Harrington closed the folder slowly. This aircraft, he said, turning slightly so his voice carried through the front cabin, was authorized to transport Sergeant Carter to Washington, D.C., where he is scheduled to receive a Congressional Medal of Honor. A quiet gasp moved through the rows. Ryan didn't move. Couldn't. Because everything he had acted on, every assumption, every decision now stood exposed, not loudly, not violently, but clearly. And clarity, in that moment, was worse than accusation. Elias said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was no longer invisible. It was undeniable. And as the truth settled into the cabin, slow and irreversible, one thing became clear. Nothing that had happened could be undone. Only faced. Ryan Cole stood frozen in the narrow aisle, his hands at his sides, his posture still straight but hollowed out, as if something essential had quietly collapsed inside him. The uniform he wore, the symbol he had trusted all his life, suddenly felt heavier, no longer a shield, but a mirror. For the first time in years, he did not have an answer ready. Not a command. Not an explanation. Just silence. And it was louder than anything he had said before. Elias Carter remained standing near the front, calm as ever, the same man he had been 10 minutes ago, and yet now the entire world around him had shifted. The difference was not in him. It never had been. It was in what people finally chose to see. He adjusted his coat slightly, a small, habitual movement, then looked at Ryan not with anger, not with pride, but with something far more difficult to face. Understanding. Son, Elias said quietly, his voice gentle, steady, don't let what you see decide who someone is. There was no accusation in his tone. No bitterness. Just truth, offered without force. Ryan swallowed, his throat dry, his mind racing for something, anything that could undo the last few minutes. But there was nothing. Because this was not a mistake he could correct with procedure. This was a choice he had made. And now he had to stand inside it. Behind them, Colonel Harrington watched in silence. He had seen men break under pressure before, but this was different. This wasn't fear. This was realization. And sometimes, That was harder to carry. Agent Melissa Grant stepped slightly aside, creating space not just physically but symbolically. The situation was no longer under investigation. It was resolved. But resolution did not erase consequence. Officer Holloway shifted his stance again, this time more formally, his posture straighter, his gaze respectful. He gave Elias a small nod, the kind exchanged between men who understood something without needing to speak it aloud. In the cabin, something began to change. It started with Marilyn Scott. She slowly stood from her seat, her movements deliberate, her expression no longer hesitant. For years, she had taught children about fairness, about courage, and now, she acted on it. One person, then another. Daniel Mercer rose next, lowering his phone completely. This moment was no longer evidence. It was something else, something human. One by one, passengers stood. No announcement, no instruction, just recognition. A quiet wave of respect moved through the cabin, growing, spreading, until the entire front section was on its feet. And then, softly at first, hands came together. Applause. Not loud, not explosive, but real. It filled the space in a way words never could. Elias paused, just briefly, taking it in not as a reward, not as validation, but as something returned. Something that had always belonged to him, now finally seen. He gave a small nod. Nothing more. He didn't need more. Colonel Harrington gestured gently toward the front. "Sir, we're ready when you are." His tone carried respect, not rank. Elias stepped forward. This time, no one moved away from him. They moved for him. Ryan remained where he was, watching as Elias passed. For a moment, their shoulders aligned close, but not touching. Ryan opened his mouth, as if to speak, to apologize, to say something that might lessen the weight pressing down on him. But Elias had already moved on. Because some lessons are not answered. They are lived. The cabin slowly settled back into their seats, but the air had changed. Conversations didn't resume immediately. People sat with what they had witnessed, each in their own way. At the front, Lena Brooks wiped a quiet tear from her cheek. Not sadness, not exactly. Something closer to clarity. She looked at the system in her hand, then turned it off. Next time, she thought, she would speak, and she knew she meant it. Minutes later, the cabin door closed. The jet bridge pulled away. Engines stirred to life beneath the aircraft, low and powerful, like something waking from beneath the surface. Ryan returned to the cockpit, his steps slower than before. The checklist in front of him remained the same, the instruments unchanged, but he was not the same man reading them. He hesitated for a brief second, then continued, because flying the plane was still his duty, but now it carried something else. Understanding. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate and began to taxi, the runway stretched ahead long, open, unforgiving, and when the plane finally lifted into the sky, it carried more than passengers. It carried a moment that would not be forgotten. A quiet fracture. A necessary truth. And somewhere between the ground and the clouds, something unseen had shifted, not just in one man, not just in one cabin, but in the way a single story could ripple outward, changing what people believed about power, about dignity, and about the cost of seeing too little, too late. In the quiet, after the engines rise and the sky opens, the story does not end. It lingers, like a soft whisper carried by something greater than us. Because sometimes, what we call coincidence is not coincidence at all. Sometimes, it is a moment arranged by God, placed gently into our lives so we can see what we were too busy to notice. A man judged in silence, revealed in truth. A mistake that could have remained hidden, brought into light at the exact right time. Maybe that wasn't luck. Maybe that was grace. God doesn't always speak in thunder. Sometimes, he speaks in moments like this when a heart is humbled, when truth stands without shouting, when a stranger reminds us what dignity really means. And maybe the real miracle wasn't that Elias was honored, but that everyone on that plane was given a chance to see differently, to become better, even if just a little. Because in our everyday lives, we do the same thing more often than we realize. We pass judgment too quickly. We decide who someone is before we truly see them. And yet, what if every person we meet is carrying a story we cannot imagine? What if every moment is a quiet test of who we choose to be? So tonight, wherever you are, take a second. Think about a moment when you might have judged too fast or stayed silent when something didn't feel right. And then remember there is always another chance to see deeper, to act kinder, to listen longer. If this story touched something in your heart, don't just scroll away. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still matters. And tell me in the comments, have you ever witnessed a moment where someone was judged too quickly and the truth changed everything? And if you believe, like I do, that stories like this are not accidents but quiet reminders from above, then stay with this journey. Subscribe and be part of a place where every story carries meaning, every voice matters, and every heart has a story worth hearing. May God watch over you, guide your steps, soften your heart, and bless you with the wisdom to see beyond what is visible.
Advert Paul had a story. We share powerful story of loyalty and courage. If this story took you, like the video, share your truth in the comment and subscribe for more.